Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and SciCode. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting presentation ahead. First, I need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. So today's session is being recorded. If you miss any of our discussion, or maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. Over there is where you're also going to find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just from where you are joining us. And you'll also notice there is a handouts tab. There are a couple of resources there available for you to download to aid with today's presentation, so please do download those at your own leisure. And of course, before we close, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So the topic of today's program is Next-Gen SCA, securing modern SDLCs with pipeline composition analysis. And I'm joined by Julie Peterson, Senior Product Manager at SciCode, and Orion Cassetto, VP of Product at SciCode. So Julie and Orion, thank you both so much for joining me. Orion, do you want to get us kicked off from here?
Absolutely. So as Cody alluded to, we've got 2 speakers today. We'll just dive in real quick. Julie, you want to tell us about your background?
Sure. I'm a senior product marketing manager here at SciCode. I have worked in tech for my entire career, and the last few years I've been in the security space. And my past employers include Mend, formerly White Source Software, IBM, and IDC, among others. Orion?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm VP of Product Marketing here at SciCode, and so I've been in the cybersecurity industry about 15 years, and much of that in the application security space, and then also, I guess, a brief stint in security operations in SIM. So some AppSec companies that I worked at that you might know include Distill Networks and Imperva.
Great.
All right, so today's session agenda. So what we'll be talking about today, first, Julie's going to tell us a little bit about how we address the software supply chain security issue. What are the challenges that we need to overcome, and how do we actually overcome them? Then we'll take kind of a deeper look at software composition analysis and where its strengths lie and where it falls short in terms of being a tool for software supply chain security. Where we found areas where SCA falls short, we'll talk about a new type of tool, which is pipeline composition analysis. So you can think of it as next generation SCA, and we'll look at how it solves some of those problems. And then we will open it up for Q&A at the end. So as Cody said, if you've got questions, feel free to use the Q&A tab, and we'll answer them wherever we have time throughout the presentation, and definitely at the end in the Q&A session. Cool. So Julie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so, we're here to talk about software supply chain security, right? The title of this is Securing Your Modern SDLC, and software supply chain security is continuing to be a challenge that we're all facing and trying to deal with. So, one of the things that we've seen, starting with SolarWinds, a high-profile attack, is that the number of attacks and the intensity of the attacks are growing. And they're just getting worse. So we're seeing, attackers sitting in systems for longer and longer and doing more damage. And Gartner is telling us that by 2025, nearly half of all organizations worldwide will be the victim of some sort of software supply chain attack. And that's a 3-fold increase from just last year. So this problem is just getting more and more significant, and something that we really need to focus on. So why are we seeing such a rise in these software supply chain attacks? Well, the bottom line is that attackers are shifting their priorities from applications in production that we've done a pretty reasonable job of securing to the software supply chains themselves. So for far too long, software supply chains have been a bit of an oversight for more organizations. And despite a number of really high-profile breaches, they're still kind of not really the main focus for most AppSec programs. And attackers are just like the rest of us. They're going to go after the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. And, the supply chain is that at the moment. And one of the things that we're seeing with these supply chain attacks is you get in through one tool and you can move laterally, into source code, into production applications. You can sit there for longer undetected and really do a lot more damage. And so it's a significant problem that we really need to focus on now. So before I go any further, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to what we mean by software supply chain security. And so I thought the easiest way to do this would be to use the analogy of a traditional supply chain that we're all, pretty much familiar with. And in this example I'm using is a car being made. Think of it like a Ford F-150. You've got, certain components that are built in-house, right, like the engine. But there's also a number of components that the car manufacturer will just outsource. It's easier to do, think like brake pads, right? And then you have a manufacturing infrastructure, sort of the manufacturing line where everything is put together all in one place. And then finally, you have workers who are assembling the pieces into one great whole. Now, if there's a problem or a defect or a deficit in any one of these components, you're going to end up with a substandard product rolling off your line. So, you might have a car with some kind of recall down the line, and obviously it's something you want to avoid. Now, if you think about software, it actually maps pretty nicely to this traditional software supply chain. And what we see is your custom code are the in-house components that you're developing yourself. Dependencies like third-party software or open source components are your third-party components. Your DevOps tools and infrastructure, right? So the tools and things that you use to actually build your software and move it from code to an application that actually can run is your manufacturing infrastructure, and your developers are your workers. Now, software composition analysis, which is what we're talking about today, is the part that focuses on these third-party dependencies, these sort of unknown bits. And you can do a little bit of research and sort of figure out what it is that you're pulling into your software, but you don't always have the full picture. And with open source, for example, a vulnerability might be discovered several years down the road. And so it's something that you don't necessarily fully control. And so you need a tool like software composition analysis to monitor these pieces. So what software composition analysis is a AppSec testing tool that does three main things. The first thing that it does is it scans your code base to come up with an inventory of all of the open source components that you have. The second thing it does then is it looks for all of the related open source licenses that relate to the components that you're using. And the reason for this is that you want to make sure that there aren't any restrictive licenses that require you to make your derivative works, say, open source as well, right? You want to be able to monetize and sell your product down the road. And so you need to make sure that you have permissive licenses only. And then finally, the third thing that software composition analysis does, and you can argue that this is the most important part, is that it will scan your open source libraries for any known vulnerable dependencies, right? So it looks against the MVD, it finds out whether there's anything that you need to be concerned about, anything that's exploitable, so that you can then prioritize and remediate your vulnerabilities so that you're sure that you're sending your customers a safe and secure product. Now, many SCA tools can also create an SBOM, or a software bill of materials. And you can think of an SBOM as an ingredient list, right? So sort of all the things that went into the bread that you bought from the grocery store last week. You can kind of see fully what's in your software. And this provides visibility into all of the components that you're delivering to your customers. And we're seeing a lot more talk about SBOMs over the past year and a half or so as a result of a White House executive order on cybersecurity that came out last May that essentially said that if you're a software provider that wants to do business with the federal government, you need to provide a software bill of materials with the delivery of your software. And the idea is that by being transparent, the federal government can make good decisions on what software is safe to use, and therefore can help secure their software supply chain. Now, what we see in general is the federal government, once they make a policy like this, it tends to sort of trickle down into the rest of the industry and sort of become the de facto standard. And so we're really expecting SBOMs to be kind of part of the cost of doing business going forward. Now, based on this SBOM, software composition analysis vendors have done a really, really good job in saying that they offer software supply chain security. And that's because they're telling you, all the pieces and components that make up your software. But I think you have to really take a step back and question, does SCA really solve the software supply chain problem? And if you look at this is the Google SALSA framework, right, which is also, again, designed to bring visibility and help prevent software supply chain attacks. And I think one of the takeaways you should see, just, by quickly glancing at this, is that there are a lot of attack vectors when it comes to securing your software supply chain. And so, although software composition analysis is really important, it is just one of the many attack vectors involved in supply chain attacks. Now, it's a really important attack vector, and we also feel that it could be expanded upon, that though it gives you some good value, that you can expand it to encompass your whole pipeline or pipeline composition analysis to actually sort of build a better mousetrap, right? So expand upon the promise of software composition analysis to do more. So the rest of what we're going to talk about is where we feel that software composition analysis has some limitations, and then how we see pipeline composition analysis coming in to sort of fill these gaps to give you a bigger and better solution to actually help secure your software supply chain. Okay, so the first challenge that we see for software composition analysis is that AppSec tools like SCA are stuck in silos, right? So software composition analysis is really focused on your code. It doesn't really have any visibility into your build tools or your artifactories or your cloud environment, right? It's really focused on lines of code and the components and libraries within that, all of the dependencies that come in. And so what we're seeing is, there may be the ability to scan various parts of your pipeline, but they're sort of standalone. There is really no context. There's no way to see the complete pipeline as a whole. And so, we know that having a lot of alerts can create a lot of noise, and it can be hard to determine what's real, what's not, what's important, what needs to be fixed first. And so having all your tools stuck in silos essentially really hinders this ability to deliver effective software supply chain security. So that's one of the first gaps that pipeline composition analysis fills, is that it gives you complete visibility of your entire SDLC, right? How are you going to protect your entire software supply chain if you can't see it? So that's sort of step number one. And what pipeline composition analysis does is it looks at all of your different tooling, right? So your SCMs, your build tools like Jenkins, artifactories, cloud, and more, and it ingests data from those into a graph database, and it's also looking at SCA data as well, and it's connecting the dots between all of these different tools so that we can find the relationships between data. So we use things like activities and events, usage and permissions, configurations, even the security controls of each individual tool to better understand your full environment so that you can make sense of what presents a real risk versus what is something that you could safely deprioritize. And the end result is end-to-end visibility of your entire development environment and your software pipeline. So again, you have to have visibility of your entire SDLC if you want complete SDLC security. Ryan, number 2 for you.
Awesome, thank you. So the second challenge of software composition analysis is essentially that it's only looking at application code dependencies for vulnerabilities. And actually, there are many other types of dependencies. So if you move forward, we'll start talking about them. What do we mean by codependencies? Essentially, these are dependencies that are in your code base, things like open source libraries. And what it's doing is it's looking for those open source components, and it's looking for vulnerabilities in those open source components. The main takeaway here, though, is if you think about what is the idea of a dependency, it's something that essentially you're using in your software or the production of your software that you don't control. And so if you just expand that definition, there are many other types of dependencies that could also be vulnerable and could pose a risk to your software. And so, another type of them is the actual tools that are used themselves. So if you think about it, these tools, things like your SCM, your build tool, your container registries, your cloud providers, they perfectly fit that definition, right? They are things that you use to make your software that you don't control that could be vulnerable and could impact the quality of the software that you build. Let me give you some examples. So build tools. If we think about probably the most famous example here is TeamCity, which is a build tool that's made by JetBrains, and it was essentially pivotal in the SolarWinds attack, right? Their TeamCity got compromised, and that led to the SolarWinds compromise, which, as we all know, is probably the most famous software supply chain attack. Another example, one that came up more recently in August, is GitLab, which is an SCM. So GitLab had a vulnerability that allowed for remote code execution. So again, that's not the sort of thing that you want in your software delivery processes and your software pipelines. So the takeaway here is that these are tools. They are produced and controlled by other people that can have vulnerabilities that could result in a similar thing. So you need a way to deal with that. There are other types of vulnerabilities, such as plugins to the tools we just talked about. So this could be plugins to your SCM. It could be plugins to your build tools. An example that came up earlier this year in July was for Jenkins. So Jenkins plugins, they essentially, think to yourself like a Chrome plugin, right? They add additional functionality to Jenkins. And essentially what happened was there was a couple of dozen of these plugins that were in the Jenkins marketplace that had vulnerabilities in them. And so it's the same concept. It's needing to find those vulnerable versions of plugins and then make sure you're not using them. So the same idea as SCA, but for a different type of dependency. There are more that pop up as you move through your software delivery pipelines. The next one is build modules. So these are your GitHub actions and your GitLab runners. And essentially what they are is their automation, their jobs that are being run as in your build tools. They are often run or they're produced by third parties. You can get them out of a marketplace, and they provide kind of automated functionality. So the one you're looking at here is Try in Web IDE. And this particular GitHub action is created by Red Hat. So, again, this is code that is, pivotal for the production of your software that is created and owned and operated by somebody else and could have a vulnerability in it. And moreover, these can bring in additional layers of dependencies. So if we move forward, build modules can also introduce other dependencies. And how this works, a build module, just like normal code, nowadays is 80 to 90% open source libraries and open source components. And so what that means is your build module, let's say that one by Red Hat, could have an open source library, and that open source library can have a vulnerability in it. And so you get right back to the idea of SCA, but in an area that an SCA tool can't look at. And it's just further into your pipeline and it requires a lot more visibility. The last example I'll give you is from infrastructure as code. So oftentimes people use infrastructure as code to provision cloud infrastructure in an kind of automated and repeatable way. And your infrastructure as code templates and files can actually do things like run a script or call in a package that's, again, an open source component that could have a vulnerability in it. And so the takeaway here is there is a very big need to look at other types of dependencies that pop up in your SDLC and in your software delivery pipelines for vulnerabilities. And pipeline composition analysis essentially promises just that. If you can move us forward. It's greater breadth of vulnerable dependency identification. So this can help to better align your security measures with the risk of having a breach from those vulnerable dependencies. And so essentially what you're looking for here is, or what PCA is providing, is the ability to find dependencies in code, just like you would with SCA, but also throughout the rest of your pipeline, and to find known vulnerable versions of tools and plugins and build modules and any other dependencies that pop up through the rest of your pipeline. So that is capability number 2. Julie, back over to you.
Thanks. So the third challenge that we see in software composition analysis is that it lacks visibility into vulnerability locations, specifically where they have been deployed, right? So SCA is really good at identifying vulnerability locations in application code, but then after that, it loses sight and can't track the vulnerability or the vulnerable package as it moves through your pipeline. So why is this a big deal? Well, if any of you remember a little thing called Log4j, it came in on a Friday afternoon, ruined a lot of security professionals' weekends. And basically it was a vulnerability that was pervasive, used in so many different applications, sort of all around, and had a critical status that needed to be patched right away. So great. What security professionals did was they used their SCA tool, if they had one, and scanned for where it was in their code. Excellent. Found all instances of the code, was able to patch it. The problem is then how do you ensure that that patch has been pushed to every instance, right? So that every container that has the vulnerability has been spun down, you've spun back up the patched version, and you're no longer running a package that could be exploited in production. Well, the bottom line is that SCA can't tell you. So companies that were most successful in remediating this quickly had performed some kind of manual audit internally to basically identify, every server in every data center in every location worldwide on where this application with this vulnerability had been deployed. And again, if they had that kind of plan where they could see it, they could then contact the owners of these various servers and make sure that it was then pushed. But there was no way to really determine whether all the vulnerabilities had been fully remediated. So, you kind of did your best effort, but you couldn't be 100% sure. So one of the things that PCA has done is, because it can see your whole pipeline, it can actually understand where your vulnerability has been deployed. And so if we take that Log4j example again, think about it. It took 3 patches for the vulnerability to actually be fully remediated, right? So there was one, that came out pretty quickly on Friday, and then another one on Monday, and then another one later in the week. So if you have, many applications running on many different environments, then you have to, do this times 3. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of sort of sweating it out, making sure you've gotten everything, you haven't missed anything. By pipeline composition analysis, by being able to kind of show you where it is in production environments, you can be sure that not only is your code patched, but it's not running any longer in a production environment. So this makes you more agile in your response times, and then you can be more assured that your remediation of the vulnerabilities is fully complete. And again, when you think of something that has such a high impact and a high velocity like Log4j, being able to see where something is in deployment is really priceless and can save you a lot of sleepless nights. So the fourth challenge that we see in software composition analysis is based around prioritization. So prioritization is really limited to your code and vulnerability information. And so the first factor that SCA uses is the CVSS score. Now, every CVE is released with a CVSS score from low, medium, high to critical. And so that is to help you understand what needs to be remediated first. Remember, we're getting a lot of alerts, on a daily basis. There's a lot to worry about and remediate, and limited resources. So how do you put your resources to the best use? Well, CVSS score was originally intended to be that. And there's been a couple of different iterations trying to fine tune it. But the reality is that most CVEs are released with a CVSS score of either high or critical. So more than half of them are released with this designation. And the problem is when everything is an emergency, nothing is emergency, right? It's not an effective way to actually prioritize your vulnerabilities. So what a lot of the software composition analysis vendors did was they tried to improve upon just using a CVSS score by bringing in other factors. And reachability is one of those other factors. And so what reachability is it determines whether your application has a direct path to a vulnerability in code. So how this works is if we look at this graphic over here, the squares are your libraries and the triangles inside them are various functions, right? So you'll pull, say, for example, an open source library that has multiple functions. And as you know, sometimes those functions will pull in their own dependencies, and those dependencies will pull in additional dependencies, right? So this is the problem of transitive dependencies and using open source. And so what some SCA tools can do is they can look and say, okay, you're pulling in this one. It has a direct call to another method, which then goes directly out to a third library. And oh, by the way, it has coded here that you are actually calling and using in production that has a known vulnerability. And so you know from here that that is something that you need to give a higher priority. Now, if we look at this middle path, again, we have the same issue of transitive dependencies, but the third level is a library that, although it has a known vulnerability in it, your code is actually not making a direct call to the vulnerable function. And so you can effectively deprioritize this particular vulnerability because you don't have a direct call to it. And again, this last path shows a very similar thing where, again, there might be a function in a library you're using that makes a call to a known vulnerability, but because you're not exercising that function, you don't necessarily have to remediate immediately. It's something you can deprioritize. And while using reachability to prioritize can be very useful in cutting down the noise of all the security alerts that you're getting, we feel that pipeline composition analysis can do it slightly better in that pipeline composition analysis goes beyond just looking at your code and considers what your runtime environment is and includes runtime information and exploitability. So what does this mean? Well, there are certain vulnerabilities that need a specific set of environment or specific environment in order for that vulnerability to be exploitable. So if we look for something similar to Log4Shell, Spring4Shell, it's a known vulnerability, but it actually requires a really specific environment in order to be exploited. And that includes a JDK of 9 or higher, Apache Tomcat, running as a servlet container, and a whole host of other things. If you don't have one of these specific environment requirements, then you can effectively deprioritize the Spring4Shell vulnerability, right? Because you don't have the right conditions for it to be exploited. So again, this is looking at like a runtime environment and allowing you to fine tune your prioritization so that you're really focusing your resources on what matters first, right? And we know our resources are really limited. And so anything we can do to kind of cut down on the noise is going to be something very, very useful. Well, Ryan?
Sure. Thank you, Julie. So the fifth challenge, and I think this is our last challenge, comes down to understanding the actual pipeline itself and the tools that make up the pipeline and configurations and security settings of those tools. So think about your software delivery pipelines, right? These are engineering tools, and there are many of them. You've got your SCM and code, you've got your build tools, you have your container registries, you've got your cloud providers. So these are engineering tools. As I said earlier, they are owned, operated, maintained, configured by engineering. And, calling it what it is, essentially, these tools are set by default for productivity because they're catering to engineers. No one is going in or someone needs to go in and make them, aligned with better security controls and best practices and things. And so essentially these tools can be misconfigured and someone has to go in and make sure that they're, set to a better state. Now, The problem is compounded because each team that you have is selecting the tools that they need based on, their experiences and the jobs they need to do. So they may pick, one set of tools to make up a software delivery pipeline. If you have another team, they may have different people with different experiences and different problems to solve. They may pick a completely different set of tools. And so you may end up with kind of a matrix of tools that you need to, wrap your arms around from a security standpoint. And if you participate in, any acquisition activity and you buy a software company, you get all of the teams and tools that they have. And so this very quickly turns into a kind of an unmanageable mess of, trying to wrap your arms around the configurations and security controls of the tools that make up your software delivery pipelines. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because, and if you look at an example, the state of New York Office of IT. So, often, and can you click forward one, please? Thanks. Often what happens is that the very basics of security configuration really come back to bite people here. For the New York State's Office of IT, essentially what happened was their SCM was GitLab. And what they had failed to do was to configure it properly. And essentially anyone could log in from the internet. They could create an account. They could add or give themselves admin privileges and then access the entirety of, kind of their code bases and repos and everything that included, secrets and proprietary information and intellectual property and all sorts of things. And so that can be a really, really big problem. And it could have been one that, had somebody just gone in, known what the setting was that needed to be adjusted and just adjusted it to the, best practices or even, basics of security, it could have been avoided. And so that is the problem. The software composition analysis is so focused on the code that it's not able to kind of zoom out and look at, okay, well, so what's making the code and what's building the code and where are my containers and my artifacts, where are they living? And what is the settings of all of those tools that hold and house and build everything? And so pipeline composition analysis provides a path forward here. If you can move us forward. So the fifth capability of pipeline composition analysis is essentially looking at the configurations and security controls of all of these tools and helping to harden them. And that's things like automatically and uniformly implementing security controls like least privilege to make sure that people don't have more access privileges and rights across these tools than they need to do their job. Branch protection rules, authentication settings, tool configurations like we saw with the State of New York Office of IT. And so being able to do this and understanding the state of the pipeline and the tools and to harden them is really a huge capability and just something that you can't do with SCA. So what does it look like if we bring all of these things together? So if we just said, all right, well, all of those areas where SCA falls short and pipeline composition analysis can help, what does that look like in aggregate? And essentially the takeaway is this. So pipeline composition analysis is the next generation of SCA. It is a superset of the capabilities of what you get with software composition analysis. It does everything in SCA and more. And the more is better visibility. It understands deeply what's happening in your SDLC and your pipelines and the configurations of everything. It has greater breadth. It's looking for more types of vulnerabilities in more places across your SDLC. It has faster and more complete remediation. Faster because we know not only at the code level, but also at the production level where the thing that needs to be fixed exists. And more complete because we can answer the question, does this problem still exist in my environment? Do I still have Log4j? If so, where do I need to fix it? It offers better prioritization by offering the same types of prioritization you get from SCA, but expanding that into an understanding of what's happening in runtime and kind of taking into account the idea of exploitability. And then it helps to secure your pipelines by understanding the state and configuration and security controls of the tools that are actually being used to build your software and understanding if they are in tune or in alignment with security best practices. And so this is the premise of pipeline composition analysis. So we've covered a lot. Just a quick recap of what we talked about today. So first and foremost, software supply chain attacks are a large and growing problem. These are the SolarWinds attacks, that type of attack. Securing your third-party components is absolutely an essential part of your software supply chain security program, but it is not the entirety of it. SCA thus is not it is an important tool, but it is not the only tool that you need to do a good job with software supply chain security. In the world of SCA, there are things that can be improved, and pipeline composition analysis represents an evolution of that, the next generation of what that tool set could be used if you zoomed out and did more with the concepts. And so that includes better visibility, more ability to find different types of vulnerabilities in more places, being able to pinpoint the locations of those, again, in production and in code, better ability to prioritize, and a better understanding of how the pipeline works and how the settings of the pipeline influence your security program. So that's it. Hopefully that was useful. We'll get into Q&A in just a second, but real quick about SciCode. We are a complete software supply chain security solution. We offer 8 different AppSec tools that help to kind of plug all the different holes that are, attack vectors that could cause a software supply chain attack. They largely fit into 2 groups: those that find vulnerabilities throughout your entire SDLC. So that's SAST for finding them in custom code, next-gen SCA or pipeline composition and analysis for finding them in your dependencies. That's the topic of today's webinar. Container scanning to find them in containers, and IAC scanning to find misconfigurations in your IAC templates and files that would turn into a vulnerability in the cloud. We also offer a host of pipeline hardening tools, and kind of the theme here is tools that help keep attackers out and prevent breaches. And that's, pipeline security and governance. So the configurations of the tools and the settings, the security controls across your pipeline. It's code tampering. So, essentially understanding how code is moving through your pipeline and how it's moving through the handoffs of the SDLC and the tools involved, and making sure that it's moving through that pipeline with integrity and hasn't been tampered with in a malicious way. It's hard-coded secret detection to find hard-coded secrets that could be used to gain access into your environment or to move laterally through to facilitate kind of a furthering of an attack. And code leakage detection. So this is finding your proprietary code out in the wild on code sharing sites to make sure that attackers can't gain access to your intellectual property and use anything they find there to either reverse engineer an exploit or use a hard-coded secret to get into your environment. All of this sits on top of our graph database backend that connects and coordinates between these different tools and with the tools of the SDLC themselves. So that's it. We will move over to Q&A now. So feel free to use the Q&A tab if you have questions, and we'll answer as many of them as we have time to. All right. First question. Doesn't SCA also scan during build processes? Isn't that protecting the software supply chain? Julie, is that something that you want to take a stab at?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that. I'm happy to. So yes, SCA can scan at various points of software development, right? So you can even do it, pre-commit. You can do as part of the build. So yeah, you can scan at that point, but the thing to remember here is that you're still only looking at application code, right? So you're not looking at any of these other dependencies that we talked about today, like, a Jenkins plugin, for example. So you're just, again, you're just scanning application code. You're just scanning it at a slightly different point in the process. So PCA, again, expands the definition of what is a dependency to a broader list of things that could potentially be an issue down the road.
Cool. Lots of questions coming in, so I'll just start with the next one. What kind of tools are available to make IAC scripts like ARM templates, Terraform, and Ansible secured? So I guess I can handle that one. So there's a couple of things. So our solution is going to look at those for misconfigurations. It's also going to look at them once they're, that infrastructure is running in the cloud and compare the two to look for drift. It's also going to look at those same IAC templates for, essentially any dependencies that are being called out to, and to check if those dependencies have vulnerabilities in them. So I guess there's 3 layers. In the IAC code itself, looking for misconfigurations, looking for drift once it turns into the production environment, and then looking for vulnerable dependencies. So that's the 3 layers of kind of security there. Okay, next one. how big of a deal is something like a Jenkins plugin? How likely is it to be used in an attack? Julie?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. Yeah, so I mean, so we've definitely heard a lot of issues with Jenkins plugins. There was one just in August, I think that you mentioned, where there were something like 28 plugins with more than 32 known vulnerabilities or something like that. And what we've found is that, yes, it is a way into the supply chain. And in fact, we've heard of instances where attackers have actually got Jenkins credentials and then got into that way, and then they've used known vulnerable plugins and installed them and to actually create a backdoor in. And the problem here is that most accounts don't really have like a fine level of granularity into permissions, and so if you get access to a Jenkins account, you can likely add a plugin without anybody noticing and, without needing any special permissions. And then again, this has been used in a couple of different attacks to create a backdoor in. So I think it's something that you really have to think about. For sure, all of these additional plugins and dependencies are, they're being exploited. Weaknesses in the fact that people aren't looking at them specifically is being taken advantage of by attackers, and they're being exploited. So yeah, it's a big deal.
Awesome. Next question is SciCode SaaS-based or self-hosted on the customer? So I guess, SaaS-based or on-prem. The answer there is both. We have customers who are running in a SaaS model or mode, people who are running on-prem, and even you have the ability to do a hybrid if that's something that would be interesting to you. If SaaS, are you FedRAMP authorized? Currently, no, but it is something that's a future for us. I don't think that there are any vendors in the space that offer PCA that are currently FedRAMP authorized. It's a very new technology. I think people are all working through that process. So I don't think you'll find that anywhere. But we do have an on-premise version. So that is what a lot of people are using in the meantime. Okay. How developer-friendly is pipeline composition analysis?
You want to take that one? Or sure. Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. I think again, because it's a superset of SCA, it provides all of the sort of developer friendliness that SCA gives, right? So, one of the key tenets of software composition analysis is that shift left. I know you hate hearing it, but it's true, right? So giving developers the ability to inspect packages before they pull them in, or before they commit code, or certainly as part of a pull request. So yes, it's an extremely it builds on the friendliness, the developer friendliness of SCA, but just gives you broader visibility. So that's my long short answer. Do you have anything to add, or?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Okay, so there are several questions, quite a few about Kubernetes and clusters and containers and images. And I guess the takeaway of the general theme is, how does that all work? And I think the general answer is, so what SciCode is doing is integrating with all the tools that give visibility at each piece along the way. So your container registries, your cloud providers, with Kubernetes itself, etc. And what that's allowing us to do is to understand how the software is being built. So, this code is run by these build jobs, or that use these modules, and this container image is being pulled in and put into that cluster, and it's in this pod. And so by understanding how all of these things connect to each other, we're able to kind of tie them together and to basically go all the way from code to God. So it's all the way left to all the way right. And how that happens is just looking at each piece along the way and connecting the dots with a graph database. That's the highest possible answer, and I hope that it answers the 3 or 4 questions that are kind of all iterations of that. Feel free to ping me if that didn't answer your question. Next one, Julie, I guess this one's for you. Are you saying that PCA is able to prevent all software supply chain attacks just by looking at pipelines?
No, I mean, if you go back to that original SALSA framework, and I think our company's mission also speaks nicely to it. Like it's one part, it's one piece of the puzzle. it's really important. But I think, two takeaways from here is, don't be fooled into thinking that if you have a traditional SCA solution that you have pipeline security or software supply chain security, right? You don't. You have an important piece of it, but it's just one piece. And then, the second thing is that there is a way to actually make SCA better. And that's by expanding into pipeline composition analysis, which builds on that promise of software composition analysis by taking in your entire pipeline, giving you visibility, broadening the definition of dependencies, and looking at more things that could lead to a breach. So again, just it's part of the puzzle, and you need like a really holistic view of the whole environment in order to do it. I mean, this is a complex problem that we're trying to solve. If it were easy, it would have been done by now. So, I think there's definitely a lot of things you can do. Certainly that's our mission. But SCA is just a piece of that.
Cool. Yeah, there's one other question here that I think is really important and we should spend some time on, which is, hey, there are tools available to do SCA scans. How do you do PCA? I think the crux of the issue is, so I don't think PCA is something that, well, you could in theory try to build it yourself, but like the idea behind PCA is taking an SCA tool and marrying it with an understanding of the SDLC and how all of the things of the SDLC kind of relate to each other. So the answer essentially is you need to find an SCA vendor with PCA capabilities. And there are a couple on the market. There are, they're just starting to pop up. But the way to think about this is it's taking an SDLC first approach to software supply chain, to software composition analysis. It starts by understanding, ingesting all of the data from the different tools that, that make up your software supply chains. It's understanding who's in these tools, what are they doing, how do things from one tool relate to another, what are the environmental settings, what are the security controls, what's the activity, what are the permissions, and connecting the dots between those to make a meaningful understanding of your software pipelines and how they kind of work. Using that information, you bring that context to SCA, and that allows you to take SCA and basically, like, when you find something, to extend its visibility super, super far, or conversely to take your SCA engine and point it at different parts of your pipeline and then understand how that relates to the other things that are happening. And so it's essentially, it's like an SCA tool on steroids. I mean, I don't think it's something you can DIY currently, but there are vendors that can provide that functionality. Cool. I think that's our last question. Hopefully we got everything answered. Thank you all for your time. If you want to learn more, please visit us at scicode.com. We also offer a free trial if you want to, kick the tires and check it out in your environment. And I don't know, Julie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just don't forget that we have some great handouts here that you can download and look at for more information.
Cool. Cody, awesome. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Julie and Ryan both. Ryan, thank you both so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you guys before we go live. So thanks for joining me. I would like to remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. So we do still have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. So our 4 winners are Brianna G, Andre M, Joy L, and Alvin H. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, do check your spam folder. I'd like to thank SciCode for sponsoring today's program. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your days to spend it with us here on Techstrong Learning. So we do just want to ask for one extra moment to fill out a survey that will pop up on your screen as soon as we close out. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day. And Orion, Julie, thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thank you.